Welcome to the fourth talk of this day. I'm going to be talking about hard problems in blockchains. In particular, I'll focusing on my three favorite ones: long-range attacks on proof-of-work consensus protocols, proposer election, and randomness beacons, and post-quantum blockchains. Now, though the title of this talk is hard problems, I don't want to give an impression that blockchains have a lot of problems. They're in fact working quite well already, and they're becoming more user-friendly, cheaper, more energy efficient, so we're seeing a lot of progress there. But with this talk, I guess I want to advertise that the blockchain space here is really fruitful for problems to work on, a really good resource of research problems. I think that's where academic research can have really great impact, which is fast and can potentially be huge. So that's the space for innovation where you can see very quick and fast deployments of your ideas in practice. Yeah, I will show you three particularly problems that are particularly interesting to me, but there are many, many, many more. So for all of these problems, I'll show you some solutions. They're to some degree not quite satisfactory, so if you come up with something better, it will be great. So I'll start with the long-range attack problem. It only applies to proof-of-stake blockchains. So the problem there is that the way the proof-of-stake blockchains are built, so the validators are working together to finalize blocks. As a result, they produce some notarization of these blocks in form of digital signatures usually. So the validators notarize one block, then they move to the next block, they work on it, notarize the second block, etc. And that's how they build the blockchain. And typically, active validators stay honest due to incentives, because in proof-of-stake, validators are locking their stake, and if they misbehave, they're going to be penalized, they're going to be fined for misbehaving if, for example, they double sign two conflicting blocks, they will get hit and their stake will get slashed. So there are really strong economic incentives for active validators to stay honest. But if we look into kind of the lifetime of the validator, it's probably sometime when the validator is validating the blockchain, and some larger span of time where the validator has staked the coins and can be subject to slashing. And maybe there is even larger span of time where the validator just holds some assets on the blockchain. So really during this time, validator is very unlikely to try to attack the blockchain because it has some stake there. It's kind of incentivized to keep the value of his stake the same or increasing, but definitely it will not be incentivized to try to attack the blockchain during this period where it holds assets there. But the validator can exit the blockchain through an exchange. It can just cash out or exchange their coins to coins on another blockchain and just completely lose any incentives to stay secure, to stay honest. And from that point onwards, there is no incentives for example, for old validators to keep their keys safe. And there is this problem in proof-of-stake blockchains that if old validators become corrupt, then the safety becomes broken. Because when they were honest, they were building the correct chain, but if past validators suddenly became corrupt, they can decide to fork the chain and just produce a completely new alternative history. And this will be really cheap for them in proof-of-stake because all they do is just they are signing, basically, and that's very cheap to try to repeat, to kind of grow the chain of the same length. It's not the case for proof-of-work, where you have to solve a lot of proof-of-work puzzles. It's very hard in proof-of-work blockchain to catch up to the same length, but for proof-of-stake blockchains, because all validators do quite simple and efficient computations, they can easily grow an alternative chain that's long enough. And then for a poor user, who was sleepy and maybe didn't follow the chain too closely, when the user wakes up and sees those two alternative chains, it will be very hard to differentiate which one is the honest one and which one is the corrupt one. And the blockchain typically they have very number of keys throughout the lifetime. So sometimes a lot of validators will be working on the blockchain, sometimes very few. So you will have this fluctuation in the number of validating keys. And the points of time where the number of those keys is really small is kind of nice points to try to attack the blockchains, try to corrupt these validators. Maybe they still remember their old keys, try to extract old keys from them. So the blockchain kind of can have variable degree of security during its lifetime. So there are different mitigations for long-range attacks, and I'll go over each one of them. First one is checkpointing. That's kind of straightforward. You have centralized checkpointing where you just upload your most recent block to some centralized servers. Maybe it's a GitHub code base, so you just bake the block, the hash of the block inside the code of the validator itself. So when the validator joining, for example, to be validating, it will just make sure that the chain that it downloaded matches whatever hash is baked into the code that the validator is running. But you can also checkpoint, to a newspaper like New York Times or wherever you like. And the more you checkpoint, the better. But then if it's not centralized, then you are back to the same problem of how, if there are conflicting checkpoints written to different centralized sources, and how do you negotiate between them? How do you pick the correct one? You're kind of back to the same problem if you start checkpointing to multiple places. And the other approach is checkpointing to a proof-of-work blockchain. It seems today to be the most practical approach and the easiest one to implement for any chain. But it's a little bit weird for some projects to be checkpointing to another chain and kind of rely on security of another chain, and especially for those who are kind of trying to pledge for being less electricity wasteful. If your security is, at the end of the day, relies on a proof-of-work Bitcoin, we still argue that you're as electricity wasteful as the Bitcoin because you rely on it for security. So there are problems with this approach, but again, as of today, checkpointing the proof-of-work blockchain is probably the most practical approach. The other approach to mitigating that is making validators rotate their keys frequently. So that's a good practice in any way, because if the validators are not rotating their keys, it's kind of it becomes easier to attack the blockchain. Especially that's true when you have a varying number of validators. If your validator set was small at some point, but then it grew to a large size, and now you, as an attacker, you, for example, attacked 2 validators out of 10, in this case, it doesn't give you enough advantage to fork the blockchain at timestamp 4, but since the validators were using the same keys throughout, kind of going back in history, at some point, these 2 just constituted a quorum. And when they constituted a quorum, that means that you can fork the blockchain and, from timestamp 2, just create an alternative history onwards. So the solution to that is, of course, either incentivize validators to rotate their keys frequently, but then you need to trust for them to forget the old ones. Or there are very nice schemes that are using key-evolving cryptography. So rotating validator keys means that validator will sign a transaction from his current public key to a new public key, so it will replace the public key with a fresh one. But an alternative construction, time-evolving cryptography, allows you to keep the same public key, so you'll be just evolving your secret key. Basically, the secret key will lose some information over time, so it will become a weaker key. And this weaker key will not be able to sign for past blocks. And there are really nice constructions for that. But in all of these schemes, we have to assume that honest validators just forget their old keys. And this approach is kind of unfortunately incentive incompatible. Like if the validators know in the future they're going to profit from selling their keys, why should we assume that validators will stay honest forever? So it doesn't solve the problem, but it's a good practice anyway. The next solution is to keep everybody online. And that's what Ethereum, for example, is suggesting as a mitigation for long-range attacks. And of course, if you're online and you're checking with the chain periodically and very frequently, it's going to be very hard to mislead you into believing the chain that suddenly appeared from nowhere. So if everybody is just monitoring the blockchain, checking in once in a while to get the latest state and kind of keeps this state in local history, in local memory, then we're going to be fine. But of course, the problem with this approach is that clients and validators can be sleepy. So it's always the case that the client may not check with the blockchain for like months, and then all of a sudden decide to transact again. I mean, we're probably not all checking our bank accounts all the time to make sure that our balance is still there. So it's the same is happening in blockchain. And the other mitigation, the project I was working on called Winkle, sorry, it got cut during conversion, but Winkle makes users vote inside their transactions on the current state of the blockchain. So the philosophy here is that instead of relying only on validators to keep our blockchain secure, why don't we also involve users and ask them to participate in providing security, long-term security for the blockchain as well. So the idea is that we will change the transaction format, and instead of having, well, for simplest transfers, we have sender, receiver, and the amount, we'll also ask users to include the last block that they believe was valid. Okay, and sign that. So there's quite complicated analysis in the paper. Just to simplify, the block is considered checkpointing if 50% of all coins have voted on it or any of its children. And we prove that under certain assumptions on the honesty of the users, and the checkpoint cannot be reverted even under the long-range attack. So with this approach, now kind of we are securing the long-term history of the blockchain, not only with validator keys, but also with users' keys. So to attack such a blockchain and to fork a historical block, the adversary will now need to attack both the validator keys and the users' keys. And of course, for typical blockchains, there are many millions, billions of blockchain users and very few validators. So you can argue that quite easily that attacking a small set of validators is probably much easier than attacking a whole population of your users. So Winkle is this, can be viewed as a second layer of consensus, where the first layer of consensus is run by the validators, so it's validator-based consensus. It tolerates typically a third of Byzantine validators, and it's quite complicated. Oftentimes, validators need special infrastructure to participate in consensus, to verify high loads of transactions, to keep a lot of memory available. So it's complicated and kind of expensive. And it stays secure as long as validators' keys stay secure. But we can use this validator-based consensus as kind of a proposer for the second layer of consensus, which is user-based. And if we assume that the validator-based consensus is honest, since validators, while they're building data, incentivized to be honest and be building correct chain, we can argue that this first layer of consensus acts as an honest proposer to the second layer of user-based consensus. Yes?
I wanted to ask, because I assume that it works only when users vote on the last block, like the block just before the transaction that just before the block, their transaction want to be included in. So basically, if your blockchain is making blocks very fast, you have a quite big probability that user will not aim at the last block, but like 2 blocks before, or like 3 blocks before. And I assume such voting does not work. Like the vote in my transaction do nothing. So you have to have 50% of transactions inside block to be precisely online.
Yeah, great question. Just to repeat, so the question was about blockchains that have very frequent block production, and so the users who are presumably need to vote on the last block may be a little bit behind, so their transaction in that case will be dropped. Yeah, so how to kind of improve usability. Yeah, I was very loosely using the notion of a block here. In fact, I should have written probably in epoch. So we can, yeah, of course, for high-frequency blockchains, we cannot ask them to vote on blocks, but we can ask them for vote on some larger intervals of time that constitute several blocks, during which, you know, we can be sure that they have enough time to sync up to the epoch, to the previous epoch. So if in epoch, say, is several hours, we should be okay assuming that the user got the state that is several hours old, at least.
For the user consensus to work, you need all the users to be online, right? Like, or sufficiently many honest users to be online.
Yeah.
How is that different from assuming that some validators keep coming back online? So
yeah,
the same thing that the users were doing, let's say you could guarantee that some validators would be online, you could just repeat it with them.
Yeah, good question. The question was, do we assume that the users are online, and if so, how is it different from validator-based consensus itself, right? If I'm getting the question right. Yeah, so this second layer of consensus, it can go much slower than the validator set consensus, because we're protecting against long-range attacks, and long-range attacks, you know, they can happen in the order of years. You can maybe go back, or several months. So the users only need to, you know, accumulate this 50% of coin votes along the course of a month for this to be protective against long-range attacks. But of course, lowering that number to something smaller would be very useful. It's just the problem is that users aren't transacting that often. Yeah, so if you look at the current blockchains, most of the coins are just sitting there doing nothing and never being transacted. They're just cold wallets are holding them. So in the paper, we're going to explore other mechanisms where you can delegate your vote as in validator-based consensus, or in DAOs. Yeah, you can kind of delegate your vote to more active users, or maybe a cold wallet can delegate to a hot wallet, and that will improve this speed to confirmation. But that will require, you know, users to be more actively participating. Of course, that creates some usability issues.
What's my incentive as a user to vote?
Yeah, so you can structure it differently. Maybe you can lower transaction fees if the user votes on more recent block. But you can also have more stringent requirements saying that we will just ignore your transaction if you're not voting on some of the recent blocks.
And also, this is a lot of messages constantly being sent. Like everybody, every token votes on every block, right? So
yeah, no, the assumption is that when you are transacting only, so when you want to transact, you can use this opportunity to also submit a vote. And then the stake with which you transact will count towards that vote. You don't have to transact more frequently.
It seems like validators or builders or whatever can now affect the user consensus by filtering information, by preferring transactions that vote for what they prefer best, even with a relatively low threshold of Byzantine users. Is that an actual problem?
Yeah, that's a great question. The question is that validators can now maybe start preferring some user transactions instead of the others, and kind of start being opinionated about which transactions they include, right? Well,
affecting the consensus, the upper consensus.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I think we're going to cover it in the MEV because that's already happening right now, that the validators and miners start being opinionated about how they want the block to look like, and so they will, will likely include one transactions and not the others. And there are general mechanisms to protect against that. But it's true that here it's the same problem as actually in the I think it doesn't weaken, doesn't make the validators more opinionated, unless they are already kind of corrupt. But we're assuming that they're honest during, while they're building the blockchain, they're just can become corrupt post factum.
Based on what should the users vote? Meaning that, like, you said that the user might be offline for a while and then come back.
Yeah.
So how does he know what to vote for? If he sees two chains, which is the attacker?
Yeah, right. So here we assume that most of the users, we'll have to make some assumptions about the population of the users as a whole. So we'll have to assume that some good fraction of users will be voting on the correct chain and will be supporting that. And that will help users who are in the minority, who are unsure which chain to vote on, to decide. Yeah, so
we need to assume that some of the users, or most of them, even know what is the correct chain?
yeah, right, exactly. And then, yeah, we're gonna kind of bake in their votes inside this blockchain so that users who are not sure, constitute a minority, will be able to figure out which chain is the correct one.
Yeah, so like I said here, because you're letting the users sort of vote on basically consent, like be part of the consensus, isn't one of the problems that, like, usually in most blockchains today, like 95% of the information about the blockchain comes from like Infura or some of the other companies, and then what will happen is you have like one or two centralized players that now not only supply all the data about the blockchain, which, you know, fine, read-only is, you know, you can argue that if it's wrong, you won't be able to send false transactions, or it's something that you can argue about. But here you have also, like, suddenly you have like write access, or like how, because the user itself will always just sort of ask this sort of centralized system of like, okay, what's the state of the block, which block should I vote for? You'll just get some block, and then if somebody attacks, say, like, let's say Infura, suddenly they can like checkpoint a block that is completely like not okay, and nobody will be able to stop it.
Yeah, great question. You're asking about Infura being kind of a centralized point through which clients are obtaining the blockchain.
The main thing is that you're sort of assuming that all of your clients really are running nodes, which in reality is like doesn't really happen.
Yeah, we're just assuming that the clients have different sources, at least different nodes from which they get the latest information. Of course, yeah, if the whole world is getting the information about the chain from Infura, Infura is already a central point of failure, right, for the world. So it's...
Yeah, but it can't write to consensus.
Yeah, so, right, okay. Maybe there... So I think there is a reason for why this level of centralization is okay today. But if this mechanism is employed, you know, the users will be incentivized to actually check with multiple sources before voting to make sure their vote is correct. So maybe that will also help shift, you know, to decentralize how users are obtaining the blockchain. Maybe last question. I'll move to the next.
Basically, your answer that isn't that counter to the disadvantage for users, because there are many blockchains, and I just want to make some kind of transfer to my friend, and I can choose a blockchain where I have like probability security and don't have to do anything except for creating the transaction, and I have the blockchain with such assumption that before making a transaction, I have to check many different sources of knowledge to be sure that transaction that I'm submitting is correct.
Yeah, that requires like more work from the users to help secure. Yeah, so you're worrying that it can lower the utility. Yeah.
Before today, that only 8% of users participating in DAO are voting. Mm-hmm. So I think that achieving 50% is like, it would be amazing. And I see why this solution is good, but...
Yeah, true. I mean, probably more needed to bring it to reality, I agree. maybe with proper incentivization, like with DAO, we're kind of, people are exploring different techniques to increase participation. Here too, we can maybe make users incentivized to vote more actively. But yeah, it's not a complete solution. That's why it's a hard problem. So I was gonna say that if you have better ideas, you kind of, yeah, welcome to propose, because that's a real problem for proof-of-stake blockchains, and just something to keep in mind. Great. So the next problem I want to explore is proposer election and proof-of-stake blockchains. So I was, when explaining this morning about proof-of-stake blockchains, I was saying that from the fixed validator set, we're going to be electing proposers using round robin. We'll just going one by one through the proposal list and assign them to propose a good block, and then we'll vote on this block to accept it. But that's not a great proposer election mechanism, so we'll explore some better ones. So let's see what are the properties that we'll want from the better proposer election mechanism. So a proposer is someone elected per time slot to propose a block, and the proposer gets rewarded for proposing a good block, and it can get slashed if it proposes a bad block. Typically, nothing happens if it doesn't propose at all, so we just assume maybe there was a network glitch. The good properties of a good mechanism for proposer election is to have a unique proposer. There are protocols that can, including longest chain, that can deal with proposer mechanisms that gives out multiple proposers, but really consensus is more simple if you assume that proposing gives you, proposer election gives you unique proposers. We also want the process to be unpredictable, so you cannot predict who will be the next proposer. So if the time t between when the proposer gets publicly known and when it announces a new block is small, in particular 0, we call such election secret. So the proposer basically announces itself exactly at the time when it publishes the block. And if this time t between when we know who is the proposer and the proposer proposing a block is larger than 0, we call it public election. So there will be some window where we know who will be proposing the block. And larger t are a big problem because you can DDoS the leader, especially in permissionless system where anybody can be a validator. Usually you don't have good DDoS protections on your validators, and so it can be really easy to DDoS attack the leader if you know who the leader is going to be. All right, so we'll want ideally mechanisms that have t equals 0. And we also want unbiasability, so nobody should be able to influence the proposal election in its favor. Unbiasability can be viewed as just a variation of unpredictability. It's kind of unpredictability under active attacks. You should not be able to actively manipulate the protocol to make your proposer election predictable or biasable. So really, there are two properties fundamentally, uniqueness and unpredictability that we want to achieve. And the round-robin proposer election that I was explaining goes through the leaders in a predefined list. It's unique, so it's good, but it's public. So the proposer for the slot is known well in advance, and the proposer can be DDoS. There's a large window where the attacker can prepare a DDoS attack. It's also biasable, in particular, if you are the last proposer to register, you can sort of figure out where you will be in this list and at which slot you're going to be proposing. So there is this also biasability aspect when you are the last proposer to register in the list. The better proposer mechanism will use a randomness beacon. Randomness beacons are very interesting protocols. They can be run standalone. It's a distributed protocol that outputs pseudorandom values at regular time intervals. Randomness beacons can be run in a centralized fashion, and there are services who will just provide you good randomness if you want to run a lottery. And there are even NIST certified organizations who generate randomness for you, also to use in gamblings, for example. But it's also possible to design a completely distributed, non-centralized protocol to generate random numbers. The problem with using randomness beacon for proposal election is that we're now introducing this circularity that randomness beacon itself needs consensus because these distributed parties, they need to agree on what's the next random number they're going to propose. And we said that consensus depends on proposal election, which we try to base back on randomness beacon. So to break the circularity, usually blockchain protocol say that we fix the proposal schedule 1 epoch in advance. So we fix the proposer schedule for the current epoch, and then those proposers help us build the randomness beacon to randomize leader elections for the next beacon. So this process is unique, unbiasable, as long as you're using the good randomness beacon, but unfortunately it's predictable. So you will know the schedule of the proposers 1 epoch in advance. And I would say that this is a really fascinating area for research because there was just enormous amount of papers published on building randomness beacons alone from different security assumptions with different guarantees, and still, every year we see 5 more papers building randomness beacons. There is a really nice systematization of knowledge paper that kind of tries to analyze all of the existing ones, and this list is already incomplete, like there are 3 more protocols being found. I want to highlight also 2 practical projects that are building randomness beacon. One is called DRAND. It's a very nice project. They have open source their implementation, but it's run by universities and private companies. There are no incentives except your reputation. You'll have your name on their website, but it's all voluntary based. It's producing distributed randomness. And there is also Chainlink that's very popular for blockchain applications to get randomness. It's a subscription service, so you kind of pay through a smart contract, you pay for getting this randomness from the Chainlink Oracle. But better protocols are still being developed and people try to deploy it, and in particular Ethereum is working on the following randomness beacon. I would say that's the simplest randomness beacon you can describe, and it's also the best one. The only problem is that the cryptographic primitives we need to instantiate it are not yet quite available or built. Just talk about it in just a second. But let me describe it. So each node pre-registers the VRF public key, PKI, and in each epoch, the node submits a VRF evaluation on the epoch number using the corresponding secret key. So what effectively it does, the node is contributing deterministic verifiable randomness. So VRF guarantees that you cannot possibly compute the value in 2 different ways. So it's only one value that you can compute as an output of the VRF, and this value is also going to be pseudo-random. So the only, and then at the end of the epoch, the values of all the validators are XORed together and run through a delay function. So let me unpack this. First, the node, it cannot submit, it cannot influence what randomness it submits. It cannot influence the VI value. It can only choose whether to publish this VI or withhold it. So each node has this one bit of bias that it can introduce by not publishing the VI if it doesn't like it. But that's why, to prevent against this bias, we have a VDF here. VDF is basically long computation, should be longer than an epoch, that is fast to verify. So it guarantees that if you're running the VDF, you get the output and the proof that you computed the VDF correctly. It's guaranteed that you've spent a certain amount of time computing the function. And it will be easy to verify that the VDF output is correct. So what it gives you is that when the validator is supposed to decide whether to publish his value VI or withhold it, it doesn't have enough time to pre-compute what will be the result of him publishing or withholding. So he cannot decide of what to do because he won't know the resulting beacon. There's not enough time for him to compute the VDF. So as a result, the validator can decide at random whether to withdraw or publish. So that eliminates the bias. And yeah, so the challenge is in this VDF construction. We have good theoretical constructions, but some of them are even running in practice. For example, the Chia blockchain is completely running out of VDF based on class groups. It's sort of not quite standard cryptographic assumption. Many people are afraid to use that type of VDF, so Ethereum decided to build a more traditional kind of VDF based on iterative application of one very simple function called min_root. So you basically just compute this function multiple times, kind of chaining it, and then to prove that you computed this function that many times, you will produce a snark, short succinct proof that the result is correct. Okay, so yeah, and to make sure also that the VDF cannot be sped up significantly, you ideally should run an ASIC for your VDF. So it's very hard to optimize on ASICs, and whenever you get an ASIC, you know, you can be pretty confident that you cannot run much faster than this ASIC. Also, ASICs are very, very expensive to design. So it's unlikely that somebody will come up, if you have an ASIC for functions, unlikely somebody will come up with a faster algorithm or a faster ASIC to kind of outpace you. So what Ethereum Foundation is doing is they're building an ASIC for this particular min_root VDF function. And as I heard, it's soon going to be available, and you can, it's very expensive to design, but that's taken care of Ethereum, and it's going to be very cheap to buy. So it should be about $50 or $100 to buy to run your own VDF on it.
Well, why do we need the VRF if honest users could just simply send true random values?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, you can also, you're right, maybe VRF here is an artifact of the existing construction where they don't have the VDF. But you're right that it can be replaced with a simple random value contribution, and this will be just a XOR of just random values from validators. Sure.
In that case, could you compute some VDF outputs and then choose my V value to match one of my pre-computed?
Oh, you're assuming that you kind of don't know.
If I can submit my V as a last person, then I can just choose it if I'm not using the VRF. Like, well, then I can just bias the whole XOR.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Oh my God, I'm blanking. Sorry, I'm jet lagged. Yes, you're right. Sorry, that's why the XOR solution won't work. Sorry. Yes, you're completely right. Thank you. So the problem with just contributing random numbers, XORing them together, is the last person to go will be able to completely overwrite the previous people's contribution by just XORing, XORing the validator's value and his value on top of that. And if he can pre-compute the VDF on his own value, he can completely predict the beacon. That's why you need VRF there.
But for that, you can first commit two values on one block and then reverse reveal them in the second one.
Yeah, great question. So the question was, can you do commit reveal style of contribution here? Yes, you can. Just requires more interaction. That's always kind of a problem. But this is this.
When you are only need this for on the validators that are already interacting with each block, because they have to achieve consensus on that. So basically, they can next to this just the random protocol all the time.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, if those are run only on validators, then yes. But with this mechanism, also you can open up this participation to users as well, or you can run it entirely user-based. So in most, general case, you would love less interaction if users are participating, not just validators. But yeah, for validators, maybe it's okay to assume a little bit more interactive protocol. Okay, cool. So this process is unique, unbiasable, but it is predictable. And the single secret leader election allows you to achieve all of these properties, but it's quite an expensive protocol. So the best protocol we know is very interactive. Each validator publishes a commitment to a secret value, and next validators take turns shuffling this list and re-randomizing the commitments. And then the random beacon is used still to do the final shuffle. And the final shuffle determines the sequence of proposers for the next epoch. But because of the shuffling and re-randomization, you kind of lose connection to which commitment belongs to which validator. And only the validator themselves, they can see which commitment they can open, so they know their position inside this list. So when it's time for the proposer to propose, it will open up its own commitment and together with this opening also propose the block. So you will know who the proposer is exactly at the time when the proposer already sent the block to the network, so there is no point of attacking it, there's no DDoS window. So that process achieves all of the properties we like, and Ethereum is in fact going to implement it. Their version is called Whisk. But you can see that it's very expensive. So the validators have to shuffle and re-randomize these lists. So yeah, anything better would be great. So just to summarize, this is what I covered with respect to randomness beacons, and just to contrast with the proof of work for proposer election, it's unbiasable and predictable, but it doesn't give you unique users. And some of the consensus protocols are fine with having multiple proposers, but I was saying that the consensus is simpler if you can assume unique proposers. Okay, in the last couple minutes, I just want to touch on the last problem that I'm a big fan of, so post-quantum blockchains and in general post-quantum crypto primitives. So I think it's very instructive. I kind of keep updating this list once every year to see what's the current advancement in quantum computing and how the size of the machines grow over time. So the last report was from IBM last year. They said they have a 433 qubit quantum computer. Now, I don't know if that number is a little bit maybe inflated because typically those machines are noisy, so you need to repeat the computation multiple times. It can also maybe not quite general purpose qubits. So I don't know, maybe you can take this value with a grain of salt. But it's also interesting to compare with what we know from cryptanalytics side. So the best results for, say, breaking RSA 3072 will require 6,000 qubits, and breaking, for example, Diffie-Hellman, or the most popular curve, NIST P256 will require 2,000 qubits. So, you know, these numbers are still pretty far apart, but they're actually kind of getting closer together. So it's kind of a little, may start to worry you a little bit that if IBM continues improving along the same curve, you know, it will quickly get to this number. And in fact, yes.
How many logical bits does this 433 include?
Well, I was trying to understand whether these are really logical bits or whether they are kind of special purpose. Was very hard to understand from their.
They're not. They're not. So these are not the same bits.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Right. So, see, there are some caveats. You need to carefully look at what kind of qubits are this. But still, I would say that this news are alarming, especially if you're not an expert in quantum computing. And this year, there was a paper published saying that a new algorithm for factoring RSA was discovered that makes it completely breakable with the current machines. And that kind of gave a hiccup to the community. Everybody started discussing this paper. It was maybe the most peer-reviewed paper this year, but finally the community kind of concluded that there is overstatement, that there is no such attack. But as we go, probably these claims will be happening more and more often, and it can well be the case that at some point, this will be close to reality. So I just want to highlight how quantum adversary can affect the blockchain. The quantum adversary can forge currently used digital signatures and steal funds or fork proof-of-stake consensus, and that's because the signature schemes that we use today are all based on problems for which we know how to build efficient quantum algorithms. So ECDSA, Schnorr, DDSA, RSA, all breakable by a quantum computer. It's not that signature schemes are breakable in general. We know good alternatives that we believe are secure against quantum attacks. It's just that these particular instances of signatures that we use on blockchains are breakable. So that's the main problem. Then you may ask, well, how about proof of work puzzles? Bitcoin is still doing a lot of hashing. Can we improve? Can a quantum attacker solve puzzles faster? And in fact, yes, it can. So due to faster search algorithms, you can search a space of size d in times square root of d. So if classical miner on one thread will spend t time to search t space, to brute force t space, a quantum computer will run t time to search t squared space. So that gives superlinearity advantage to quantum miners, and that may potentially disincentivize classical miners from mining at all. So yeah, that's been recently explored in a paper. And finally, how about hash functions? So in blockchains, we use hash functions to chain blocks, and also they're used inside the digital signatures and commitment schemes. So it's believed that though there are faster quantum algorithms to find collisions, classically we know how, due to birthday paradox, we can find collisions in time to the n over 2, but quantumly it's 2 to the n over 3. But it was concluded kind of that quantum speedup is not very practical, and it's widely believed that, for example, SHA-256 still provides 128 bits collision resistance, even post-quantum. So hash functions are fine. So the only problematic schemes, especially if you're in proof-of-stake blockchain world, are the signatures. And NIST made a really great job trying to standardize new primitives. It announced a competition in 2016 asking the cryptographic community to come up with proposals for new, better signature schemes that are quantum resistant. And this year, it promised to open drafts for public comments. It just announced the finalists that it's going to standardize. And then hopefully in 2024, we'll have first NIST post-quantum standards. So the 3 signature schemes that NIST decided on standardizing right now is Crystal, Lithium, Falcon, and Sphinx. I'll touch on them in just a second, but I just want to highlight that today there are basically 4 signature schemes that we use in the wild: CDSA, RSA, DDSA, and BLS. So we're kind of almost doubling the toolkit with these new standards. But unfortunately, the signatures are not going to be as performant as our current ones. So if you compare those finalists, so the Lithium, Falcon, and Sphinx are the finalists of the NIST competition, and below are the BLS, EDDSA, all the signature schemes that we love in our blockchains. You can see that the public key sizes, all the signatures, are significantly larger for the finalists, and several orders of magnitude larger. Yeah, so that's the main drawback of the signatures. They're several kilobytes long. Some of them are pretty fast to verify, some are slow. They're based on different assumptions, 2 based on lattices and 1 based on hashing. But I just want to say that it's going to be, for the blockchain world, it's going to be very hard to migrate to these new signature schemes just because of such enormous signature sizes. There is a new scheme, SQI sign. It was not part of the standardization process, but it gives really good, it's based on exogenous, it gives really good signature sizes. Unfortunately, it's very slow, but you can argue that maybe still practical for the blockchain. The signing takes several seconds there. So recognizing that this kind of a little bit unsatisfactory state of affairs, NIST issued a second call for standards, especially they were looking for non-lattice-based signatures, with short signatures. So if you want, I really recommend. I was participating in the first competition. We were submitting key exchange mechanism, and it was a very good process to participate in and to follow. If you want to submit to NIST, I highly encourage you doing so. I want also to briefly highlight kind of the happy transition of a blockchain to post-quantum. So probably we are right now in kind of this green phase. We're accepting classical signatures. Maybe when some good post-quantum signatures are available and standardized and we're confident in their security, we can start accepting both. Then when we kind of anticipate a quantum adversary to come about, when those 2 numbers kind of come close to each other, you may restrict your blockchain to only classically signed transactions that do key rotations to a quantum secure key. And then from some point, you have to stop accepting classical signatures. Now the question is, but what happens to users who didn't have time to rotate? Are they stuck now? Did they lose their funds? Or is there a way out? And there is actually a way out. So some of the schemes are just have quantum protection just by good luck. You know, EDDSA, for example, it produces a secret key by hashing the seed. So you keep the seed around, and then when you cannot transact with your classical signature anymore, you publish your secret key, and then you prove with zero knowledge, and we know zero knowledge proofs that are quantum resistant, called Starks, where you can prove that you know the underlying seed. And Bitcoin is kind of also has natural protection because its addresses are hashes of the public key. So as long as your transaction changes your public key every time, so as long as you transact all of your funds out of your current account and into the new account, which is quite common in Bitcoin, the chain only knows your address. It only learns your public key when you transact out of this address. But if you only transact out of the address once, and your new address will, with your funds will have this hash-based protection, and you can later on use Stark. Well, the chain will have to accept Stark proofs, but you will be able to transact out. But most of the blockchains today use CCDSA signatures. CCDSA don't have any kind of this baked-in mechanisms. So potentially you can, the simplest way to make such accounts post-quantum secure is to tweak a little bit your secret key generation and generate it the way EDDSA is generating it by hashing a seed. Well, you rather use some key derivation function based on a hash, but that's a possibility that you can kind of introduce today, and this will not be noticeable at all. You will not be changing any verification equations. But hardware vendors, of course, don't support this custom key derivation. All right, so I don't think I have time to show you one of the signature schemes. Okay, and an extra problem. So I'll just conclude. Thank you.